So it has committed nationally determined commitments in 5 areas, where the energy is one of the important areas where this government has to reduce its emission. Though it's not a big emitter yet, but Bangladesh government is committed to work towards that. And Australia is one of the important countries in the Indo-Pacific region, and it has aligned its economic activities and economic growth with the sustainability in mind. And it has been leading, it has committed to achieve net zero by 2050. And it has also been working on areas on technology, climate finance, and many other issues. So I think there is a common area, and there are some niche area where the collaboration can go ahead. So that's why we thought, taking advantage of the visiting Australian ambassador for climate change, we have organized this. And I hope that this conversation will be very useful and productive. With this, I would like to invite Her Excellency Ms. Susan Ryle, Australian High Commissioner to Bangladesh, to make her introductory remarks.
Good afternoon, panel members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's an honour to be here for this panel discussion. I'm excited about meeting you and deepening Australia's relationship with Bangladesh. On behalf of the Australian Government, I would like to commend the work of CPD, an invaluable partner for us. And most recently, thanks to this partnership, Australia was pleased to fund a study on market-based fuel pricing, which was presented at a national dialogue in November last year. On this particular occasion, of course, I'm particularly pleased to welcome our Ambassador for Climate Change, Kristen Tilley, to Dhaka. The appointment of a dedicated Ambassador for Climate Change demonstrates Australia's resolve to step up its international action and work alongside global partners such as Bangladesh to tackle the climate crisis. Australia and Bangladesh share a long history of cooperation on climate and energy. So to provide one example, we are working with the IFC, Martin's team here, in Bangladesh to unlock commercial investment in the power sector and explore pathways to achieve net zero in the energy sector. We understand the importance of building regional clean energy supply chains. And so I'm pleased to advise on the appointment of our new Austrade Trade and Investment Commissioner, who's here with us today, Mr. Ben Carson, to advance this work. So today, I hope that the discussions will shed light on these critical issues, bring out diverse perspectives, and explore transformative opportunities for us all to advance this critical agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner Susan Ryle, for your introductory remarks. And on this occasion, I would also like to extend my sincere thanks, and also like to welcome you to Bangladesh. I think you have come recently to Bangladesh, and we look forward to have a very productive relationship between Bangladesh and Australia. So I would like to now request Dr. Khondokar Ghulam Muazzem to make a short presentation.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to welcome you all to this very important Bangladesh-Australia dialogue on climate policy and green energy transition. And my presentation will highlight on 4 issues. One is climate policy and climate action of Australia and Bangladesh, how those two can be work together in the future partnership. Then green energy transition, and also the most importantly, the climate finance part, how we could actually take lessons and can move it forward, and finally strengthening the partnership for green energy transition, particularly in Bangladesh, and how Australia could partner Bangladesh in this case. As you notice that Indo-Pacific region, and you are well aware that Indo-Pacific region is the most climate vulnerable regions one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, and where Bangladesh and Australia are located. And increasingly, we are seeing that this Indo-Pacific region are taking more, aligning their economic growth along with the sustainability goals, and where the holistic climate action is taking more and more an important agenda. And one of the main area of focus is on green energy transition, and where the countries are actually working for mitigate climate change, and thereby to finding out the sustainable solution, then enhancing energy security and creating new opportunities. That's the overall objective of this energy transition goal in this region. And where I think Australia and Bangladesh's climate policy and climate action has an important area to look at. First is that Australia has taken much more of a bolder step of taking a much more of a regulatory stance on addressing the climate-related changes, not only in his own country, but at the same time as a global leader. And that's why its Senate passed the Climate Change Act recently. And also, it has taken 4 categories of climate actions that it needs to be addressed to its parliament. One is reducing emissions. Another one is improving climate change adaptability and disaster resilience. Third one is international climate leadership. And fourth one is building government's climate capabilities. So Australia, in this sense, is much more of a farmer and a more directive stance regarding climate-related policies and climate actions in its own, as well as for its global partnership point of view. On the other hand, Bangladesh's climate policy and climate actions are, of course, as you are well aware, it's a climate vulnerable country, and a large part of Bangladesh's climate policy has focused on adaptation-related issues. For example, the climate change strategy and action plan has been updated in 2022. Then it is the adaptation plan has been taken for 2023 to 2050. Then the NDC implementation roadmap has been taken. Then there is the disaster management national plan. And also, of course, there are energy efficiency, energy conservation master plan, integrated IPMP, integrated energy and power system master plan, and renewable energy related draft policy have been taken by the interim government very recently. So more of Bangladesh's initiatives are on adaptation and the mitigation point of view. While Australia's COP diplomacy are much more directives with regard to the climate finance and the green energy transition, if you see in its recent stance in COP29, you will see that how Australia has made farmer commitment on climate finance issues, like endorsed the decision to triple the climate finance for developing countries. It has signed the global energy storage and grid places to modernize the electricity grid for better renewable energy integration. It has supported the call to action for no new coal in national climate plans and discouraging future coal projects. And finally, it has partnered with Clean Energy Finance Mission under Global Clean Power Alliance to modernize investments in renewables. So we think that Australia from its side has much more a bolder stance taken to support the renewable energy, the green energy transition, both inside and along with the Pacific region. From Bangladesh point of view, the COP discussions are highly focused on the renewables because, as you understand, Bangladesh is committed for renewable energy transition, but it has a slower pace because of financial constraints where it needs international support. And it also look for much more better energy access through technology transfer for renewable energy. And it also look for energy efficiency and also like to contribute emission reductions where it urged the developed nations to honor $100 billion annual climate finance commitment. So these are the areas where Bangladesh has also like to take initiatives in that part. With regard to the green energy transition, you see that Australia has already taken its steps for transitioning its major energy-related sectors like power generation, transport, households, agriculture, and manufacturing. Increasingly, it moves towards renewables, electric vehicles, solar-based power system. And it has a very firm targets for, it set its target for 2030 to reduce its greenhouse gas emission to 43% below the 2005 levels. And gradually it like to decarbonize its power sector, transport, and the manufacturing sectors, and finally like to achieve its net zero greenhouse emission by 2050. And it has a good number of exports. Of course, Australia is a major energy exporter. Of course, fossil fuel is a major area of its focus, but in the future, it like to diversify its energy mix, and where it is a major focus in the future will be on solar panels, batteries, wind turbine components, where Bangladesh could be a major sourcing, destination for Australian technologies in the coming days. For Bangladesh, I think the energy transition process is much more slower. You can see in the power sector, renewable energy is still less than 5%. Transport sector, EV vehicles are using less than 1%, but it's growing. At household level, electricity use is 20%. Of course, it's a mix of renewables and others. In agriculture sector, there are solar-based irrigation, which is less than 5%, but there is a target for 100% solar-based irrigation in the future. For manufacturing and others, it is at this moment only 5%, but there are good potentials to further diversify the energy mix in the manufacturing sector. For Bangladesh, it has committed to reduce its carbon emission at 6.7% level by 2030 and 21.8% level with conditional targeting. And gradually, it also targeted to be a net zero emitter country by 2050. Of course, Bangladesh needs supports and from the global major partners to address and to achieve those targets. Its major import destinations at this moment, of course, the fossil fuel one are there, but in the coming days, there are potentials to import solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, equipments, and battery storage for renewable energies. At this moment, though there is no such source from Australia, but I am pretty sure as Australia is increasingly exporting its renewable energy technologies, Bangladesh could be a good source for importing those technologies in the coming decades. With regard to the climate finance, if you see the Australian New Development Program 2023 has focused on Indo-Pacific development, and where it has focused on sustainable development and lifting people out of poverty. And you see that one of the major area of its commitment is to address the climate-related crisis by increasing climate investments and better addressing climate risks. So we can expect that in the future, much more climate finance from Australia could target to the Asia-Pacific region, including Bangladesh. And one of its major commitment is to develop a new civil society partnership fund under which it would like to promote the civil society to achieve those targets in the coming days. If you see the Australia's ODA, it has globally, its ODA for 2022-23 was 4.8 billion Australian dollars, and of which South and West Asia received the 316 million Australian dollar, and 1/3 of that is received by Bangladesh. And among the Australia's different sectoral ODAs, you see that increasingly Australia is financing the clean energy related areas, almost around 2.5 times of its support been gone to affordable and clean energy in 2022-23. And hopefully this will further rise in the coming days. For Bangladesh, I think it has received a fund of around 106 million Australian USD for 2024, estimated one, but we expect much more partnership and collaboration from the Australian side for different kinds of programs, country programs, regional programs, and global and other programs in the coming days. But most importantly, this slide indicates that how much resource Bangladesh needs for addressing its climate actions and climate-related changes. And you see that at this moment, Bangladesh annually receive an annual demand is $22.6 billion for different kinds of climate-related risks and challenges. For example, climate adaptation, climate-related mitigation and renewable energy, private sector disaster preparedness, and climate-related government expenses. But at this moment, Bangladesh received only $4.4 billion. And that a large part of it comes from the national climate finance and very less from international climate finance. So there's a huge gap between the national and the international one, and there's about $18.2 billion gap out there to address the climate-related finance domestically in Bangladesh. So how Australia and Bangladesh could look forward for a green transition? This is my final slide. I try to develop some areas, around 8 areas where I think that Australia, Bangladesh could consider future partnership. First is that joint renewable energy projects, where Australian support could expand collaboration in solar, wind, hydro, and other renewable energy related areas with Australian technology and investment. Second is that climate resilience strategies, like enhancing knowledge exchange on climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable land management to improve the resilience in vulnerable regions. Third one is that green technology transfer. It could be for establishing bilateral partnership to accelerate the adoption of green and renewable technologies, energy efficient systems, and smart grid solutions. Fourth one could be sustainable goals alignment, where both countries could identify areas of alignment between Bangladesh's green energy and renewable energy related policies and plans, including MCPP 2030, with Australia's net zero targets and climate policy, ensuring a shared commitments to a greener future. Fifth one will be policy dialogue and regional cooperation by expanding policy dialogue to share best practices, foster regional partnerships, and advocate for increased international climate finance. Sixth one could be blue economy collaboration, where both countries partnering for advancing offshore renewable energy, marine conservation, and climate resilient coastal infrastructure through joint research and technology sharing. Seventh one will be financial and the research collaboration, where strengthening the joint research support targeting to climate resilient infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, and increased funding for green initiatives. And the final one would be capacity building and training, where developing training programs, scholarships, and workforce development initiatives to expertise in renewable energy and climate policy could facilitate Bangladesh's green energy transition in the coming days. So we look forward to have a good discussion, good conversation in the presence of the Honorable Australian Climate Change Advisor, Climate Change Ambassador, as well as our Climate Change Advisor, who will soon join in this discussion. And thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Moazzam, for this presentation, which actually set the context of our discussion. Now, I would like to turn on my distinguished panelists. Let me start with Her Excellency Ms. Christian Tilley. So as we have heard from the presentation that Australia, its international development strategy policy, which was released in 2023, it has a focus on, in fact, it mainstreams the finance and also climate change actions, basically, and it is reflected in the official development assistance program as well. And also it has, it prioritizes the issues of Indo-Pacific region and Southeast Asian nations also. So if you could just, highlight, okay, I would like to welcome our advisor for the Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining. Please.
My apologies.
No worries.
For being late.
So on behalf of CPD, I would like to welcome you once again, Ms. Rizwana Hassan. So we have just started. I mean, the presentation is over, but we'll have a conversation among 3 panelists. I was going to ask questions. So this is basically about your climate policy, which through which you have mainstream various climate actions, which also focuses on the Indo-Pacific regions and Southeast Asian regions. So if you could just shed some lights on this, elaborate a bit more, and also in this context, how it can stretch towards the other regions, including Bangladesh, which is vulnerable to the impact of climate change.
Thank you very much, and thank you to CPD for organising this great event today, and for the wonderful crowd that's turned out to be part of this conversation. And Honourable Advisor, I'll give you the short version of the great presentation we just saw, which is Australia and Bangladesh together, we can solve climate change. So we'll get into some more details on that. No, I wish it were that simple. Maybe just before I touch directly on an answer to your question, Fahmida, which is about how we're using our development assistance to help drive global climate outcomes, just to pick up on some of the points in the presentation on Australia, I think what I'd just add is, for those that aren't familiar with Australia's sort of economic and industrial history, we have been a very fossil fuel intensive economy for generations. We have a lot of coal in Australia and more recently natural gas, which has meant we've had an abundance of cheap energy for many, many, many decades, the vast majority of which we export to other countries, and that's still the case. And many of the policies you saw on the screen before, and that was a great summary of many of Australia's key policies, but our government over the last few years has been absolutely committed to driving a very ambitious, accelerated transition for Australia to get to net zero. And that's predominantly focused recently on transitioning our energy system. So despite this abundance of coal and natural gas that we have, the government is pushing from what was around 32% renewables in our electricity mix 2 years ago to a target of 82% by 2030. It's a very, very ambitious transition. But we also know that our role as a major energy exporter to the world, which has been coal and gas for many years, will change as well. And much of that is up to the speed at which the countries that buy our coal and gas undertake their own transition. So there's a lot of sort of market forces at play there. But then, of course, when we look at our role and our geography in the world, we're a country of the global north that is located in the global south. 22 of our 26 nearest neighbouring countries are developing countries. And that is, of course, the part of the world where certainly our foreign policy, but our development assistance is prioritised. So that is, as we heard before, predominantly the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But I will really acknowledge, and in my role in the Foreign Ministry and working, I won't say really closely, but observing very closely and working from time to time with our Foreign Minister, I've certainly observed a real increasing focus on South Asia and Indian Ocean countries, and an increasing presence for Australia to be a trusted and reliable partner in this part of the world as well. So what we've done in the last couple of years through our development assistance program, and indeed when we look at our foreign policy partnerships and our trade agreements, is say, how does net zero and how does climate resilience factor in those policies? And with our development assistance, what our government did just a year and a half ago was set a new policy, a blueprint for the next 10 years for our development assistance that hardwired climate change into our ODA. And so starting from 1 July last year, we now have targets that half of all our new ODA investments must have a climate change outcome. So that doesn't mean that we've got a silo of funding that we say this is climate change funding. This means that we work with our partner countries, in this case Bangladesh, and say, what are your development priorities and where does Australia have expertise, financing, and collaborative approaches that we can work with you to help deliver those objectives. And that might mean that it's resilient infrastructure, or it might mean it's education and training that is about resilience to climate change. But certainly, as I'm learning so far in my visit with a country as climate vulnerable as Bangladesh, that is about working right down at the community level to help you build greater resilience for your people and your communities to tackle the challenges that climate change brings.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to you later. So the structure is such that I'll ask a few questions specific to the panelists, but then I'll come back on a more general conversation, the perspective of individuals on the in the context of geopolitical changes. So I would, yes, I will go to him. I'll come to you later. Yeah. Is it already here? Yeah. Okay, so Martin, I would come to you. IFC has been working on climate business and also climate finance to some extent, and your strategies, 5 strategies I see, that clean energy, climate smart cities, climate smart agri-business, green buildings, green finance. So it has been working with various financial institutions. What is your experiences working across the world? You work many regions, in many countries. So what is your experience in terms of, which one or which countries, which projects has been most successful and why that was so? And if you can share your experience and also what could be more appropriate in the context of Bangladesh.
Okay, thank you. Does everybody here know what IFC is? Who IFC is? Hands up if you don't know. Don't be shy. We just posted a video on our Bangladesh Facebook page. It gives you in 10 minutes, it tells you what we do and also what we don't do. So we're the private sector arm of the World Bank. We're owned by the governments both of Australia and Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh has recently participated in our first ever capital increase. So we are owned by the taxpayers of Bangladesh. We have been active here since 1985. We have invested cumulatively about $9 billion in the private sector of Bangladesh. Last year, we did about $1 billion in new financing, half of which is long-term finance, so that's machines, equipment, factories, those kinds of things, and the other half is trade finance, short-term finance, which currently is very important, as you can all imagine. We have a team of about 100 professionals here in country, almost all of them from Bangladesh. And Australia is one of our biggest partners, both globally and especially here in Bangladesh in terms of country programs through various sectors, and that also covers climate. So just as an introduction. All the funding that we bring to Bangladesh is on commercial or quasi-commercial terms. We do not have grant funding sources. Secondly, we invest at our own risk. As opposed to the World Bank that has a sovereign guarantee from the taxpayers of Bangladesh, we invest at our risk. So if investments go south, don't work out, that's it, we have to write them off. Now, in terms of climate finance, I think we all are motivated by the same facts. In fact, I just came from a workshop that is also supported by the government of Australia with the Energy Advisor. And I asked everybody to turn the temperature in the room up to 25 degrees. I noticed we're certainly below 25 degrees here at that moment. As you know, it was just in the newspaper this morning. He instructed all government offices to keep the temperature at 25 degrees and above. I think we're all aware of the urgency. It's important and urgent that we pivot the world away from carbon-intensive energy production and all other forms of carbon emissions. And nowhere more so than in Bangladesh, which, as was pointed out, is one of the most climate-affected or climate risk-affected countries in the world. I also cover Bhutan and Nepal. The situation there is exactly the same. And in fact, yesterday, the AQI in Kathmandu was worse, even worse, believe it or not, than in Gulshan. So we are all in the same boat. Now, as far as our investments are concerned, we have been pivoting already for several years away from anything that's carbon intensive towards climate-focused investments. Last year, almost 50% of our investment volume was already climate-focused. In other words, had a climate purpose. We invest in 3 major industries: financial sector, real sector, which is of course very important here in Bangladesh, especially in the garment space, and last but not least in infrastructure. So throughout all of our investments, we're moving towards climate finance. And as of July this year, July 1st, all of our investments, and this is a promise we have made to our shareholders, will be fully Paris aligned. At the moment, 85% of our investments are Paris aligned. So we're vetting not only the new investments, but also the past investments towards Paris alignment. So I'll stop here. All I want to say, it's a road. The road takes a while to get to the goal, and it's super urgent. Let me just ask one quick question. Does anybody know when the first UN Climate Convention took place? 92. Okay, excellent. So what was the percentage of carbon intensive energy production at that time? 85.1%. Sorry, 80, now I gave away the joke here. 86.6%. So the punchline is 25 years later, it was still 85.1%. So we decarbonized in the total energy mix by 1.5% globally. This is the global number in 25 years. Now we want to leap to 80% of whatever it is, non-carbon emissions on our energy production. So we have a huge task to do. And the good news is Bangladesh has excellent engineers. We have so much knowledge here. We have leading enterprises that are already certified. Nowhere more in the world more LEED certified factories than here. So I think we can teach the world a lot, and with the support of Australia, we'll have a lot to be proud of.
Thank you, Martin, for reminding us what is the progress globally. And we have 25 years more to reach net zero. So I don't know, I mean, it's up to our wild imagination how we can reach there. Anyway, so I would now like to turn to Honorable Advisor for Environment, Forest and Climate Change. When we talk about Bangladesh, in addition to Bangladesh's climate vulnerability, what is most important is that finance, technology and capacity development. So in the presentation, and you also know that there is a huge financial gap. The National Adaptation Plan, that requires $230 billion by 2050. And then also the annual, so if that is the calculation, we need 23 billion annually for climate finance. And we know the sources of climate finance domestically. The annual development program has allocation in the national budget, and there is Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund. Globally, Green Climate Fund is one of the important sources. But there are other initiatives also globally. For example, while we are talking about Bangladesh-Australia partnership, Australian Climate Finance Partnership, ACFP, is an opportunity which also takes support from the ADB and other MDBs. So how we can take advantage of such opportunities. And related to that, you see, since we are mostly focusing on adaptation, but at the same time, Bangladesh also has targets in NDC's national determined contributions. It has renewed and increased its targets. By 2025, we are supposed to reach 10% of our energy sources from the renewable sources. And by 2041, 40%. But as we know that as we speak now, the contribution is very low. So how do we address these issues?
Wish I knew the answers. I really don't know I mean, theoretically, yes, I know the answers. But practically, it's very challenging, particularly for the interim government, because we here have people who are committed to green transition, who are committed to renewable energy, but we are having to spend our days and our months, one in firefighting, and other one is in lessening the burden that we have inherited from the last regime. If one just sees how much financial burden we have on our shoulder in the energy sector alone, that is eating up a lot of the financial resources that we have in hand. Let us always keep that figure in mind when we talk about the ambition level of the interim government for a transition. I don't think the debate should be taking the shape of adaptation first or mitigation first, because there are lessons that we can take from the development pursuits of the ones who are primarily held responsible for this crisis called climate change. There was a model that they followed, and they followed the model at a time when there was hardly any science about climate change. But now anything we hear, anything we talk about in climate change arena has a scientific backup. So why following the same pathway that the original creator of climate change followed in their development pursuit? Second is why, now that we are having to deal with coal-based power plant, and I remember before going to COP29, I was having a discussion with my energy advisor whether I can sign the UK declaration on no new coal-based power plant. He said, as much as I would love to do that, for now I can't commit anything in concrete terms because of the legacy that we have inherited from the previous ruler. But for the sake of Bangladesh's own people, and to ensure that we are not reliant heavily on import for our energy supply, we have to actually emphasize for that green transition. For that, you need massive planning, extensive planning. We don't have enough time to get into that extensive planning, more so when we're having to deal with all these very problematic deals that the country signed. So I think for a country like Bangladesh, which will be one of the worst sufferers of climate change, and we are already confronting some of the challenges, we should focus on adaptation, and we should also ensure that our investments in all sectors are climate resilient and do not intensify even the local environmental problems. They may not add up to the carbon load of the world, but they can add up to the local environmental challenges if we don't follow the paths that we call green. For example, if you go to the coal-based power plants, you hear complaints from the surrounding communities about air pollution. 28% of the sources of air pollution is coming from the power plants. So if there are better options for us to take, why do we have to follow the wrongful path only on the argument that we emit globally little? But nationally, our emission is day by day increasing, and that's not proving good for the people and for the environment. On adaptation, adaptation should not be prescribed without basic human rights being recognized. Yes, there is waterlogging, so you tell us, please rise the level of your plinth for your houses and you survive. That is not how survival should be defined. So I think adaptation should have a strong human rights element in it so that we are not forced to continue in adaptation while others keep on emitting. The challenges are manifold. We do have financial constraint, and we do have lack of technical understanding. There are other challenges. I see that you have 3 questions for me, so I'm reserving some of the answers for the other 2 questions. So for example, it is often said that Bangladesh does not have enough land that's required for the solar panel. But I think there have been studies done that shows that yes, you do have adequate quantum of land required for the transition. You do have rooftops that can be a potential. There is also some potential of wind that before last 2-3 years was being said that we don't have the potential. It's very important for Bangladesh to think about an energy market where it will not be heavily import reliant because the prices vary, the markets are volatile, and if we have to spend on adaptation, because we are not getting the required fund from those who are historically responsible, then at the same time investing heavily in import reliant energy sector gets even more problematic. So I think I'll stop here and we'll get into more concrete answers when you ask me the other two questions.
Thank you very much. Now I would again turn to Kristen Tilley. So I have the, I also asked in the first question that, how Bangladesh can take leverage of the technological expertise what Australia possesses and how we can be part of that journey together. And what kind of policy and regulatory measures should be in place if we want to take advantage of the technological progress from Australian experience?
Thanks for that question. I'm certainly not an expert in Bangladesh. This is my first ever time here. But even if I was, I wouldn't be comfortable saying here's what Bangladesh needs to do. So allow me to maybe answer that question from where does Australia have expertise and experience, and then you can make your own judgment about where we can match make, so to speak, between us both. But certainly, as I mentioned before, as a country that has been heavily reliant on fossil fuels, undertaking a fairly rapid shift ourselves, we've learned some of the challenges with that task and with that ambition, and principally those are around needing, wherever possible, to have an integrated power system so that when you're short on solar power in one place, that gap can be filled by wind power from another part of the grid. And so we've invested a lot in the interconnectivity of our national grid from one state to another, from one part of what is a fairly large geographic nation to another. And the other thing that I think has been really important, and this goes to your point about how to motivate and encourage investment, is we have a history in Australia, sadly, over the last 20 years or so, of climate issues and policies often being a subject of partisanship between our major political parties, and we have elections that are often fought on strong climate ambition versus slower climate ambition. And so that has been a handbrake in Australia, in that investors are often not sure if the policies might change at the next election or not. And so one of the things our current government did when it came into power nearly 3 years ago was legislate some of our emissions targets and legislate some of our major climate policies and emissions reduction policies, so that even if there's a change of government, it would take a much larger change of the parliamentary makeup to undo those laws. So a little bit of sort of insurance making at a legislative level to lock in some of the changes we've made more recently. What I would say, though, is while Australia has always been very fortunate in having an abundance of energy, whether previously fossil fuels and as we transition renewable energy, we do know that we're a very, very heavily trade-dependent nation, and we sell a lot of things to the world. I noticed the slide earlier that had a lot of Bangladesh's coal and gas comes from Australia, but your renewable supply comes from other nations. I could guarantee that a lot of the inputs into the renewable technology that's made in China or the US starts with Australian critical minerals and often Australian intellectual property and technology. So I think we need to recognise as well that the global market for energy is very complex and has a lot of crisscrossing supply chains. And so looking at how global supply chains can feed into Bangladesh's transition, I think, will be an important thing to bear in mind. The final thing I would just say that we've learned as Australia as well is that having, and in our case it's called an integrated system plan, that says, well, here are our emissions reduction goals in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but actually then sequence the planning in ways that need to happen. And in Australia's case, we're very fortunate in that we have a lot of investors saying they want to build large solar plants, large wind, offshore wind in Australia. But we know that to move ahead with that in the absence of the grid connecting it all would be the wrong way to do it. So sequencing the entirety of your energy system to support a more rapid transition. So in our case, grid first, which is complex. We're a large country and we have certain communities that, you know, don't readily accept large power lines being built on their properties, so a lot of community consultation to allow then the very ready projects to connect to the grid to bring down bring up that renewable energy to bring down those emissions. All of that to say, I think we've got some significant experience in rapid energy transition in Australia, some of which I'm sure will be transferable to Bangladesh to meet your plans and needs.
Thank you, Excellency. Now, Martin, once again, I turn to you. So you have this strategic initiative called Blue Finance and Adaptation and Resilience Finance, which has been quite successful in some countries, for example, India, Egypt, Colombia. So you have been working with the private banks on this. Can this be, applicable in the case of Bangladesh? This is the first question. And the second is, IFC's experience in climate smart agribusiness. Could this facilitate solar-based irrigation in Bangladesh?
Excellent question. So first of all, on the blue finance, that is indeed an area that IFC helped to develop, at least at the international financial organizations level, in terms of helping to develop the principles for that. As of today, we have issued 10% of the global blue bonds that have ever been issued. Okay, so those have been issued by IFC. So that's a global picture. That's a growing market. Now, that total market is about $17 billion. That sounds like a lot of money, but on a global financial scale, that is a rounding error. So obviously, we need to do a lot to promote that market and keep it growing. But it's certainly a growth space, and I am in discussions with several potential interested parties in and around Bangladesh to focus also on blue bonds. The biggest hurdle there is the, what would I call it, the current state of the bond market here in this country. We have a lot of room for improvement to develop our capital markets. We are working with our counterparts in BSEC and BB and elsewhere, also of course with the government and the Honorable Finance Advisor on making progress. But unless we develop the whole bond market, the whole blue bond market will take a while to catch up as well. On financial institutions, we work directly with financial institutions across the region. Currently here in Bangladesh, we work with about 7 or 8 banks mostly, and climate finance is part of what we do with them. So when we focus, for instance, on MSME finance, we often provide additional advisory services on how to make the investments in the loans in the SME space climate friendly. So that is a space that also requires a lot of awareness building among the bankers. I'm happy to say that the average banker here in Gulshan, up and down Gulshan Avenue, and also, of course, the folks in the NGOs are very aware of the issues, because we're all, as we said at the beginning, we're all sitting in the same boat. So the climate topic is becoming ever more important also at the loan officer level in the banks. You asked about the irrigation. So we as IFC have not done irrigation finance here. As you know, ITCOL is heavily involved in that space. It's a huge growth area. Irrigation costs in Bangladesh account for 43% of total agricultural costs. So it's a massive chunk of the total cost structure of agriculture. So the more we can do to decarbonize that and go towards solar irrigation pumps, the better. We're certainly ready to assist. We've done that in other countries, for instance, in Morocco and Egypt at scale. We are currently in discussions with ITCOL both on solar rooftops and also on these pumps as part of a PPP structure. Since IDCOL is a government-owned bank, it is not our direct mandate to work with IDCOL, but we're working around that hurdle right now. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Martin. Now, I would like to also ask the Honorable Advisor. In the previous sections, you touched upon the issue of green energy, but I would also, want to take this little ahead, that you focused on the time limitations of this government, but then assuming that you have more time, what are the areas in terms of policy and regulatory measures the government could do in expanding renewable energy or towards meeting its target? First, and then how, since we are talking about Bangladesh-Australia collaboration, so how Australian support and experience can help Bangladesh towards achieving its goal?
Do not pray for any extension of the tenure of this government. Thank you. No assumption, no such assumption. We are ready to really, wrap up latest by June, as said. See, if I answer the last part first, Australian experience, I'm sure, will be applicable so far technology, scientific understanding, devices, equipment are concerned. But we operate in very different socioeconomic realities. So I think the experience of countries with having similar socioeconomic context will be better suited than borrowing something from California or Australia. But of course, the very spirit, the vision, some of the strategies can definitely be applicable. And of course, if Australia could think of financing our climate initiative either as grant or on concessional loan, that will be highly appreciated. The reason is, on one hand, we are suffering due to climate changes to which we did not contribute. On the other hand, we are having to take on loans that our next generation will have to pay. I mean, it's double jeopardy for countries like ours. And I think it's not only about how much money we get, it's also about the quality of the amount that we get, which was a bone of contention in this COP29. I don't think the process will be very fast here, because the burden we have on our shoulders, we can't just shrug them off. These are agreements, these are legally binding contracts, and we'll have to carry on with this with the curse of these problematic deals for next few years to come. Even if it's not a very fast process, it can still be a slow and steady approach. Like, we keep on giving targets, but then we forget. We don't work on the targets. So what the interim government could do perhaps is, because the head of the interim government is someone who is the proponent of 3 zeros, so the interim government can take that seriously and can think of strengthening its renewable energy arm wing, which is SREDA. I think we need to invest more to increase the capacity of SREDA, to give it some degree of autonomy, and to ensure that our accountability in the energy sector is ensured by setting up certain checks and guards that both SREDA and the other energy wings of the government will have to follow, particularly in signing future agreements. Second could be, the government could engage with the industries that they should have facilities to get their own energy demand met from renewable sources. We know that last year was a very tough year for the export-oriented garment sector because the government failed to supply the required energy amount. So some of them have actually switched to a 100% renewable model, but that's for their, not for their industrial operation, but for their regular energy consumption. KEPZ in Bangladesh has actually set a very good example by switching to 100% renewable for their everyday energy demand. That can be a model that the government can work with the industries and agree on a time frame within which that switch will be made, and the government can also work with the financial institutions so that the incentive that is required for that can be guaranteed. The other thing could be the government could work with communities, and there are community models of solar production, rationing, transmission, selling of excess to other communities. So borrowing from what he said, I think the government can also work with the civil society groups, the community groups, and empower the communities to, and encourage them also to go for solar dependent irrigation and not otherwise.
Thank you very much for those important points. Thank you all my panelists. You have really touched upon many important issues. We are running behind time, so I wanted to ask another question, but I will, for the time, I would open up. Yeah, shall I carry on? Okay. I have another important question for all of you, common question. So this is in the context of changing geopolitical scenario. So now that many powerful, some powerful governments are out from this Paris commitment, and also, I mean, now the commitments of COP26 to achieve net zero by the middle of the century is going to face challenges. Do you think that the institutions and the governments which are working towards, I mean, in this changed scenario, are you hopeful that we can achieve the target of net zero by the middle of the century?
I am hopeful, and I think the point about net zero by mid-century is really relevant here because it's not that far away, 25 years, but in the span of time, the geopolitics you refer to, is really about single terms of government in single countries. And so if we think about, we mentioned before, the first climate convention was held in 1992. It's been a long evolution globally to get to what is quite an effective piece of architecture, the Paris Agreement. But it is the political will that determines the speed at which the world hits net zero. And we are heading in the right direction, but obviously greater action, particularly by the major emitters, is what ultimately will determine the speed. The thing I think that gives me hope is what's really changed in the global multilateral negotiations is 30 years ago it was just governments that got together and talked about the architecture and the targets needed. Now when you turn up at a UNFCCC climate COP, there are many tens of thousands of people and only very few of them are government representatives. There are business people, there are philanthropists, there are community organisations, there are NGOs, there are academics. And so again, there is a large breadth of people that are dedicated to action that will speed up and slow down at points of time, depending on what's happening in global politics. But the direction and the breadth of people leaning into this cause, I think, is bigger than one government.
Thank you. Thank you for that optimism. Now I would turn to Martin. Same questions. Are you optimistic?
Otherwise, I wouldn't work in Bangladesh. It's such a wonderful country to become an optimist about development. I think very few countries can match Bangladesh's performance, despite changes in government, but in terms of socioeconomic progress and industrialization and increase in living standards, which of course also includes a better climate. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The speed is, as humanity progress sometimes goes 2 steps forward and then 3 back. So I can't say for this day and age, where we're heading, but I think at the level of Bangladesh, we're moving in the right direction. To give a few examples, I think I already said we have the biggest number of LEED certified factories, world class, literally world class. I know what I'm talking about. We invest around the world. We're also starting the EDGE certification, for instance. If I were to give any advice to any government in the short run, because of course in the long run we all know where we need to head, but I would focus on regional power trade. We've made some progress with our big neighbor, and Bangladesh is benefiting from that. World Bank Group is investing in hydropower both in Nepal and in Bhutan as we speak. Those producers would be more than happy to sell much more to Bangladesh. That's a big, quick win. Then we need to engage in the solar sprint. The honorable advisor already mentioned that, but I really think we need to step on the gas pedal. I've been arguing for years that we should use Mirasarai, which is mostly underutilized for a huge solar farm, but we can make much progress on the solar front. Electric mobility, I think, is something we're really lagging behind. You just need to go to Kathmandu, where every 10th car now is already electric, and in our case here in Dhaka, it's almost 0. And I think we can do a lot to change that, including with some tariff changes that I think could be almost done by order of government, for instance, to make inverters tariff-free. And then another low-hanging fruit in my view, and that is actually very related to the adaptation topic, is green affordable housing. We will have 10 to 15 million climate refugees, and we need to have one of the lowest housing ownership rates in the world, not only in Asia, in the world. And we need to really heavily invest in that space. And I'm happy to report that we're working with the finance advisor and also with BB on several projects in that space. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So I would turn to the advisor. So the question is that, now that at least one at this moment, that one country is out of this Paris Agreement, which should this jeopardize the achievement of net zero by 2050? Or if so, I heard from Ambassador Christine, she said that, the activities or climate action is not dependent on only one country, but it's a collaboration. We are optimistic about our final outcome. So are you optimistic, and why so? And what kind of institutional changes are needed, global institutions, so what kind of changes are needed in order to achieve these global commitments?
My God. Thank God that you were not in the committee that sets up questions for the O-levels and A-levels. We would have never passed. See, the thing is, you can't just give up the fight, because it's a fight for your survival. It's a fight for the survival of the earth. If you don't do your bit of the task, you will just be seeing helplessly the disappearance of your neighbor like Maldives. 52 civilizations disappearing from the world because of us failing to do the required transition in the energy and other sectors. So I'm definitely optimistic, and with every crisis there is an opportunity. When you are on the wrong side of the coin, then the world observes, and the world then forms its own opinion, which forces things to change. And although there are reasons for us to be frustrated, there are also reasons for us to be hopeful. I mean, there are countries who are declaring to follow the 100% renewable pathway. So these are very encouraging stories. And what we have heard from the ambassador about their plan to switch to 82% renewable by 2030. So that's also a very ambitious target, but that's also something that gives you the required hope. And it's a struggle for survival. And the hope that I see, really coming back to us is the fact that the young generation is actively engaging in the climate discourse. So we may live without fulfilling our responsibility, but it is our children who will be facing the consequences. And these generations are interconnected and they're exposed, and there are huge knowledge base from where they can benefit. So I have reasons to be hopeful. I live in Bangladesh, I see devastating floods, and next month I see people, standing on their feet and getting back to their regular work. So yes, it's a world that is unfortunately not united so far climate actions are concerned. It's a world where global leadership is still missing, but it's a world where we are getting encouraging stories from different parts of the world. It's a world where we are, getting lessons with regard to disasters of unprecedented scale, which is really making the communities and the states worried. So I would say that I'm hopeful. And in terms of institutions, I think the process of, what I can readily say is the process of accessing fund has been made so cumbersome for countries like Bangladesh. That should be the starting point. It can't be an overhauling of the situation, but I think we have to be meeting the challenges as they come our way. Even if you want to compete for carbon trading, that process is not very simple. But for accessing funds that is required for adaptation, for emergency requirement, I mean, we are just roaming around the circle. We are not addressing the problem that's at the center. While I'm talking today, we still are to get adequate amount of money in the loss and damage fund and also in the adaptation fund. And that has been a constant struggle. So to begin with, I would say making the process easy for countries like us, and also to ensure that countries contribute adequate amount so that the communities who need the compensation do really, I won't say compensation, who really need the support actually gets it. And I also see that instead of targeting the global institutions where changes come very slow, I think we should emphasize on strengthening bilateral partnerships and deals.
Thank you very much. I think our panelists deserve a round of applause at this point. Very productive and useful discussion. Now I would open the floor for 10-15 minutes for Q&A session. And then we'll wrap up. We'll have to wrap up. As I said, we are a little behind, but then we still would like to accommodate a few questions. So I see the first hand here. Please, someone help to reach out to her with the microphone.
Thank you. Excellent discussion, and the panelists spoke very well. Ambassador, when we see one country withdrawing, or you mentioned that the climate processes are not just dependent on it, but multilateral institutions are taking a big flag. And how the UNFCCC processes will continue, because we are getting different kind of emails that even the architecture, the people in such institutions will be suffering. And so I did see Australia come up and say that they would step in and provide additional funding for climate change. My point here, or the question here, is that we've seen, ActionAid has done multiple studies, and we have seen trillions of dollars being given as subsidies to corporates, whereas the process of climate finance for communities is extremely, extremely difficult with so many requirements. How do we lobby collectively? Because it's very important for Bangladesh and other developing countries that the climate finance flows in without that long list of spoilers is what I would say. That's one. And the investment in renewables is also not picking up. So it would be interesting to see how, from where you said and other countries, that the investment portfolio for renewables picks up. Because without that, that shift is not going to be possible. And I have a question for Martin. Martin, is your financing easily accessible for small and medium enterprises? Because young women and youth are in that category, not always in the big projects. So would you take measures to provide that support? Because there's so much innovation going on, and we need to scale them up to make, change and for adaptation and for renewable energy. Thank you.
Try and respond very quickly to some really important but fairly broad questions. If I can recall where you started, which was around, actually, it wasn't really a question, but I will respond to the point about, the pause from the US government on ODA. And we're certainly not in a position to speculate as to what that pause might end up being permanently, but very much understand, particularly for a recipient country like Bangladesh, some of the concerns about what it might mean. I know our government has already made clear that we understand what the US is undertaking in terms of its review of development assistance as a pause and a review. And we've heard very clearly the areas where it said it will take future decisions in its national interest and pointed to prosperity, security, a few issues. Certainly where we've engaged in the Indo-Pacific, including in partnership with the US, we would see that for a number of areas of collaboration and US investment in the region, it is in their national interest to keep those investments and that presence there. And our government has already said that through the US's review process, where there's opportunities for us to make a case to the US government about the opportunity and advantage in it continuing to provide support and assistance in this part of the world, we will do so. Just in terms of, irrespective of the US's financial contributions or not through multilateral funds and processes, the reality in terms of the climate finance need globally is that donor funding alone is not going to be enough to reach the scale of funding that is needed globally for climate change, particularly in developing countries and vulnerable developing countries like Bangladesh. And so the small step that from Australia's perspective, in addition to increasing our own climate finance, is arguing very strongly in global forums, including at COP29 last year, that more countries with a capacity to provide financial assistance than that historic group of 30 countries that were OECD members in 1992 need to be able to provide finance. We do see the case for advanced developing countries to do more to provide climate finance to more vulnerable countries and lower income countries. But the reality is, and I speak personally here, not as this isn't an official Australian government position because we haven't had to take this position, but traditional donor-based funding is not going to be enough, and we do need to think as a global community about how the financial architecture can be retooled to bring much more sums of money to bear for this challenge. And so your point about trillions of dollars in subsidies going to the private sector, often for climate emitting activities, I think that is where the world is starting to look. The example I'll end on is within the IMO, the International Maritime Organisation, there's been a push over the last year for a levy, a carbon levy on shipping activity. And Australia relies heavily on shipping, and we're a long way away from parts of the world that send us things. So you would expect that we will face a disproportionate cost in a carbon levy on shipping. Nonetheless, we see that as a really important mechanism to drive private sector funding into decarbonising the shipping industry, as well as providing funds for loss and damage type activities for vulnerable countries. And so we think more approaches like that will be needed to drive the sums of money that we need to respond to climate change.
Thank you. Martin, very briefly.
Just 30 seconds. So a lot of our funding to the SME space goes through banks. There, obviously, we work with them to make the turnaround process as fast as possible. And by the way, the improving digital backbone of Bangladesh is helping with that. We are waiting for more progress on digital banking, but we're on the road. Now, in this innovation space, it's not quite so easy. We have invested in a few VC funds and venture capital funds and PE funds in the region, but bringing money into Bangladesh is one thing, getting it out is a completely different thing. And so we're actually working again with BIDA and others on improving that environment, because otherwise it'll be very difficult to attract capital that wants to invest in innovation, even at that SME level in climate finance, for instance. We have a similar problem, by the way, I think, on our bigger sister, the World Bank side. There is funding available, but the absorption in Bangladesh has been fairly low. And for that, we need more government reforms and more reforms in the public sector to make sure that when we allocate funding, for instance, to adaptation projects in rural areas, that it can actually then be deployed through public works and so forth. And there's many other people who are working on that. I hope that answers your question.
I'll take another 2 questions. Very brief, please be to the point, and a brief question, not comments, please.
Hello. Thank you. Very concrete questions to both
side.
Christine and Rizwana, madam. You are talking about finance, but I am a solar businessman, and I can assure you, we are ready, the private sector of Bangladesh are ready to, overturn the situation from 10% to whatever it call. We are ready to invest. Only one policy hindrance is there. Ms. Rizwana, Miss, you are well aware of there is a policy lackings for the direct purchase of renewable energies. Grameenphone has been speaking for many years. See, the buyers are ready. So what are the hindrances that you are a revolutionary government now? What are the hindrances that you can't approve of this direct purchase? And to Christians, to support Rizwana, I believe she was talking about SREDA. SREDA in our country is promoting net metering, but I strongly believe there is nothing called like net metering in Australia. You have the grid readiness, technologies and policies for the universal solar producer or renewable energy producer. You allow them to export to the grid. They are monetizing on it. But we are the solar businessmen don't have that opportunity other than the IPP. Getting an IPP is so much hard here in Bangladesh. So if you got my questions, Christine, are you ready to cater those support and technology for SREDA to make our country, business exportable?
Thank you, understood. This side, I'll take the questions first because we are running really behind.
Thanks, I will be very quick. First, if I may introduce, my name is Zhuo Chen from the World Bank. I'm here for a visiting mission with our Dhaka-based energy colleagues here. We just come from DOE, Department of Environment, before this one. We are working with Bangladesh in building the Article 6 readiness to access international carbon market. And I believe Bangladesh has achieved a lot in the past 12 months, despite all the domestic situation changes. We just signed our first Paris-aligned carbon purchase contract with Bangladesh last week to monetize around 60 million carbon finance support to the energy sector. So my quick question to the honorable advisor is, what are the sectors you think Bangladesh will prioritize for carbon market support from what you have observed? And for our Australian colleagues, how Australians view on carbon market? Do you think this is something Bangladesh can continue focusing? Thanks a lot.
absolutely. We're strong supporters of development of high integrity global carbon markets. We do have a domestic carbon market in Australia. Right now, we haven't got an intention to link that internationally because we're building up our own suite of carbon projects to feed into that market. But we have a review of that legislated scheme in 2026, and one of the areas of focus of the review is beyond 2030, should we open up that scheme to international carbon markets? So that's an open question, but in terms of the role and benefit of global carbon markets, we're a big supporter.
For the carbon market thing, I think we'll primarily look for forestry as the sector. I'm not a strong advocate for carbon market, but I know that it's a global reality and countries would like to get some extra funding. I'm saying I'm not a very strong advocate because of the fact that it actually entails the risk of making a compromise with the mitigation, actual mitigation needs and targets. On the issue of direct purchase, I'm not the right person to answer it, but I think if you can present your case properly before the energy advisor, I'm sure he'll give you a positive decision if he's convinced about it. But I don't think revolution has got anything to do with direct purchase of renewable energy. Let's not mix up revolution with every aspect of our life. But of course, we can think differently because for this interim government, like the previous government, there was interest in making money and personal benefit out of energy deals. That is totally absent in this government. So I think you have a better possibility to get support from the Energy Ministry in favor of your proposal. Thanks.
If I could just add to our colleague from the solar side, as we speak, the Honorable Energy Advisor is on a panel to discuss pivoting beyond the IPP model to a PPA model that would be essentially in your favor, okay? So they're working on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I really apologize for not allocating more time. We are constrained by time, so we have to stop here. But I would like to thank each and every one of you who have joined us and listened to the discussion, and of course my panelists here and my CPD colleagues here who made the presentation and prepared the presentation, and also my colleagues at the Dialogue Division who have set this dialogue for us. So with this, and also my colleagues at the Australian High Commission who have worked towards this dialogue to become successful. So have a good evening, and we look forward to have you in our future dialogues. So thank you very much once again.